In the quiet orchard-laden autumn, the leaves lay thick and yellow on the ground. The air was crisp but carried a lingering warmth from days gone by. Old branches reached up to the dull sky where they would soon hold no more than ice or snow. There, amidst the trees' shadows, stood Hiroshi, once a young boy who left this village with dreams of adventure in distant cities. Now an old man, he returned to find that much had changed and yet everything remained the same. He found himself standing by the family home, now vacant, its windows dark and shuttered. The silence was profound. Across the yard, his neighbor's wife, Yumi, came out with a basket of late apples she'd been gathering for days, some red, others russet to brown. She smiled when she saw him and approached slowly, her feet stirring leaves underfoot. "Hiroshi," she said warmly, "I thought you were gone forever." He offered his hand, the same he had as a child but now with lines of time etched deep in each palm. "Yumi-san," he replied quietly, "it's been too long." She paused near him and looked around at the orchard sprawling behind them. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon. "Come," she said simply, "let me show you what remains." They walked side by side, not speaking much but moving with a shared rhythm as if time had looped back to when they were young friends in this very place. Yumi handed him an apple, and he took it, feeling its cool weight and smooth skin against his palm. "Do you remember these?" she asked, pointing at the oldest tree where branches curved low and thick with age. "You used to climb up here every summer." He nodded, remembering climbing high and wide in this very spot, once fearless but now aware of every limb and joint that creaked beneath him. The apple felt different now, something not just sweet but full of earthy depth. Yumi stopped walking suddenly as if struck by a memory or a feeling. She turned to look at Hiroshi, her eyes holding questions that did not need answers aloud. They stood there for some moments simply being together in the quiet space and shared history. Then she took his hand gently, guiding him past where the children's games had once played out, stones strewn here and there, and towards the very edge of their yard where a small path led into the woods beyond the village. The trees thickened at this point, providing shelter from the fading light but leaving only Yumi's quiet steps to be heard. At last, she stopped near a spot that had been cleared long ago, a simple grave marked by stones and wildflowers. Hiroshi felt her release his hand as if in deference to someone else's place here. "This was your mother's," she whispered softly. He looked down at the simple marker with its faint script worn smooth over time. The silence grew deeper, full of presence yet also emptiness, like an echo that fades away completely into nothingness. After a while, they turned back towards the village without another word exchanged. On their way out, Yumi slipped the apple from earlier into his hand once more, then watched him walk further down the path alone before turning and heading home herself to her solitary evening meal. Hiroshi kept walking until he reached the main road, where a thin mist was starting to rise off the ground like breath in cold air. He paused there, clutching Yumi's apple, watching as the village lights began to flicker on one by one, each becoming its own small island of warmth against the encroaching night. And then he stepped forward into this new, old homecoming and left the orchard behind him.
You're listening to the Empty Teahouse. The apple in his hand felt heavier with each step he took towards his solitary room. Late autumn afternoon, under a sky heavy with clouds and early dusk, the village square was mostly deserted except for an elderly woman sitting on a worn wooden bench.
Late autumn afternoon, under a sky heavy with clouds and early dusk, the village square was mostly deserted except for an elderly woman sitting on a worn wooden bench. She held a small bag of rice in her lap and watched the few passers-by go about their evening chores. Her name was Kimiko, but she had lived so long without a surname that everyone just called her Old Woman Kimiko. A young woodcutter named Masato walked by with his axe slung across his shoulder, heading home after a day in the nearby forest. He saw the old woman's silhouette against the fading light and thought of his grandmother, who had passed away last winter. A pang of loneliness gripped him as he remembered how she used to wait for him at this bench when he was younger. Masato stopped near her and looked down at old woman Kimiko. She didn't look up from her bag but sensed his presence and smiled faintly. "Is there anything you need, Masato?" Her voice was soft, worn by the years but still strong with a lifetime of speaking. He shook his head no, but something in him hesitated before turning to leave. The thought lingered that perhaps he should offer her some help or company, though what it might be eluded him at first. "I've been here all day," she said after a moment. "It's quite cold." Masato nodded and looked around, spotting an old quilt folded on a nearby bench. He fetched the quilt and brought it to Kimiko without a word. "Thank you." Her eyes crinkled into warm lines as she accepted his gesture. He hesitated again before asking, "Are you waiting for someone?" She smiled, her gaze far away under hooded lids. "Sometimes I wait just to watch. To be seen." Masato felt something shift in him, a quiet stirring that wasn't quite understanding but not confusion either. He thought of the day's work, cutting down trees with no real purpose other than to keep busy, and of how his hands now seemed empty. "Would you like me to walk you home?" he offered without thinking. Kimiko regarded him for a moment, and then her smile widened, revealing a gap where several teeth were missing. "That would be kind." The walk was short but felt longer as they walked side by side. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the hum of late evening insects and the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. Kimiko chattered softly about how she used to sell vegetables in this square decades ago when she was younger and strong, before her sight began to fail. They approached a small wooden house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by an overgrown garden with weeds as tall as Masato's chest. "This is your home?" He couldn't imagine anyone living here anymore. "Yes." She patted his hand gently. "And you?" "Just one more street over." They stood there for a moment, neither quite ready to part ways yet not sure how to bridge the gap that still remained between them. Then Kimiko reached into her bag and pulled out 3 small dried roots she had been carrying. "For your tea tonight," she said simply. "It's good in winter." Masato accepted them with surprise, feeling a warmth spread through him unexpectedly. He thought of his grandmother's kitchen at this hour, the familiar smell of simmering soup. "Thank you, Kimiko." His voice was gentle, sincere. She nodded and stepped toward her door as if the world had settled around her just so. Just before she disappeared inside, Masato heard her say softly to herself, company." He stood there a moment longer in the twilight, then turned to walk home along the quiet path under heavy clouds, feeling lighter somehow despite the cold and darkness.
The lantern flame swayed once, then steadied again. On a hillside terrace after a storm, rain-slicked earth glistened under the first pale light of dawn.
On a hillside terrace after a storm, rain-slicked earth glistened under the first pale light of dawn. The clouds had thinned, allowing thin shafts of sunlight to pierce through and dance on droplets suspended in the air. A lone figure moved toward the edge of the cliff where a gnarled tree stood, its branches outstretched as if offering shelter. Hans stood there for a moment, feeling rainwater soak into his clothes from earlier that night. He was no longer the soldier who once patrolled these hills under moonlit skies, and he felt lighter now without the weight of his uniform. The day ahead promised nothing but quietness and solitude, what some might call emptiness, but Hans saw it differently. Nearby, an old woman named May knelt amidst rows of small green shoots, her hands gentle as she tended to them with a watering can made from a gourd. She glanced up at Hans' approach, but did not rise or beckon him closer. He knew this was her garden and had seen her care for it every morning since he could remember. Han paused by the tree, watching May work without moving to help. His feet felt heavy against the damp soil, as if weighed down by memories best left undisturbed. Eventually, he found himself beside her, his presence barely noticeable except perhaps in the slight shadow that crept across the earth she held tenderly between her fingers. "Breakfast is ready," May said softly without looking up, holding a steaming bowl with 2 wooden spoons resting side by side on top of it. She had cooked for him before he left yesterday afternoon and continued to do so today despite his uncertain return. Han accepted the bowl quietly, setting aside his bag and leaning against the tree trunk again while May returned to her garden. He ate slowly, savoring each spoonful mixed with a few drops of rain that seeped through his clothes onto his plate. The food tasted rich and warm, unlike anything he had ever eaten in war. After finishing, Han looked around for something to do but found no tasks pressing or urgent. May's garden seemed content just being there under the dappled light, growing steadily without hurry or strain. He watched her work for a while longer until she rose stiffly and headed back toward her cottage. Han followed, placing his bowl on a small wooden table beside the doorway where he found several others waiting, their contents still steaming faintly in the chill morning air. May entered inside to gather more bowls. Han sat down heavily at the table, listening to the quiet creaks of old wood settling into place around him. As May returned with fresh bowls and a new pot of tea, she placed everything silently before her grandson's friend, who always seemed out of place among ordinary things, but never more so than now. He picked up his bowl once more, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the terrace that overlooked hills yet to be claimed by clouds again. Outside, May went back to tending her garden while Han drank tea alone amidst scattered breakfast bowls on a small table under blue skies waiting for something, anything, to fill the emptiness within him. But as minutes slipped into hours and shadows lengthened along the hillside terrace, Han felt less compelled to find meaning or purpose in what he saw around him. He simply watched May bend over her green shoots again, now softened by an afternoon sun no longer obscured by storm clouds. She moved with ease, not rushed but aware of each breath, as if marking time itself. Silence stretched between them, deep and full, until it became more than just absence of sound. It was a presence in its own right. As the day drew to a close, Han stood up slowly from his chair and began walking back towards the tree where he had first stood earlier that morning. May turned as if sensing movement behind her. She didn't stop tending but paused long enough for him to see her hands still moving gracefully through leaves and earth. Han approached, stopping beside one of her rows before looking down at it carefully himself. He reached out gently, letting his fingers graze against tender stems just beginning to sprout upwards towards the setting sun's last light. Then he turned away, leaving the terrace for the fading day beyond with nothing more exchanged between him and May except perhaps a shared awareness of time passing differently here than elsewhere. In gardens tended quietly under blue skies where sunlight dances on droplets suspended in air.
The garden gate creaked softly as Han stepped through, closing behind him with a gentle click. A salt flat at low tide stretched before her, the sun still hidden behind the horizon.
A salt flat at low tide stretched before her, the sun still hidden behind the horizon. Lynn stood on a cracked wooden pier, her feet bare, toes curling into the cool wood where it met water and shore. The air was crisp and silent, only the occasional whisper of waves reaching out to claim the flat. She had walked from dawn's first light until now, her path lined with footsteps that she alone followed. Nearby, an old fisherman named Wei sat on a low stool, his hands busy with nets. He saw Lynn pause at the pier's edge and waved lightly without looking up. "I've been watching you," he said. "You walk here often." Lynn nodded. The salt air had dried her eyes, and she blinked against it. "I like to feel the day come alive before anyone else is awake." Wei paused in his work, a net half knotted in his gnarled fingers. He offered Lin his stool with a tilt of his head. "Sit for a moment," he suggested. "It's good company at this hour." She accepted without speaking and took her place beside him, their eyes drawn to the horizon where pink and gold hues began to play on the water. For a while, they watched the morning grow brighter around them, each lost in thought until Wei pointed out a pair of birds circling overhead. "Those are the ones that return every year," he explained. "They know just when the tide will be low enough." Lin nodded again, absorbing his words as she might the salt air. "Do you ever wonder what they see?" she asked after some time had passed. "From so high up?" Wei chuckled softly and continued working on his net, the rhythm of knots and loops a quiet melody. "They don't have to tell us," he said. "But we can look down at this flat and imagine." Lin thought about that as they watched the waves roll in, closer now but still patient with their advance. She felt a strange calm settling over her, the kind that comes from being present in small moments rather than rushing ahead. The sun finally broke through, casting long shadows across the pier and into the water. Wei glanced at Lin, his eyes soft under morning's light. "Thank you," she murmured as she stood up, turning back towards home. Wei nodded, resuming his task without another word. But before Lin had taken more than a few steps away, he called out after her. "And remember," he said gently, "sometimes the best thing we do is simply be." Lin paused mid-step and looked back at him once more. He offered no further explanation but returned to his nets as if such talk were commonplace yet important all the same. The sound of waves lapping against wood filled the silence between them. She walked away then, leaving behind the salt flat and its promise of daybreak, her steps light despite knowing many miles lay ahead.
The first light caught the edges of her silhouette as she turned towards the rising sun. Late autumn settled over the orchard with a quiet authority.
Late autumn settled over the orchard with a quiet authority. The leaves were sparse on the trees, rustling in a gentle wind, as if whispering secrets to each other before falling into the embrace of the earth below. In this fading light, an old man walked slowly among the rows of fruit trees, his steps slow and measured, hands clasped behind him. He stopped by one apple tree that had refused to shed its leaves for days now, holding them like a stubborn child clinging to the last warmth of summer. The old man leaned against it, feeling its rough bark through his thin coat. He didn't move from this spot until he felt an approach. A young woman stepped into view, carrying a small basket filled with apples she had gathered as gifts for her neighbors in the village. Her name was Maiko. Her hair was dark and tied back tightly under a bandana, and she moved with a briskness that belied her age. She looked up from the path to see the old man staring at his tree. "Good evening," he said, turning toward her. Maiko nodded but didn't speak right away. Instead, she set down her basket, took off her gloves, and reached into the pocket of her apron where she kept a small knife. She bent down, examining a loose stone in the dirt path. "You know, I think this tree is just confused," Maiko said finally, as though speaking to herself more than him. The old man smiled slightly, but made no comment. Maiko took out the knife and began carefully cutting around the base of the stubborn leaves. She worked meticulously, ensuring not a single leaf was harmed or torn in her efforts to free them from the tree's grip. Once done, she cupped the fallen leaves gently in both hands and let them drift back onto the ground. The old man watched this with interest, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to understand something. "Here," Maiko said, suddenly handing him a fresh apple from her basket. "You earned it." He looked at the fruit for a moment before taking it carefully, as though unsure of what to do next. "I have been thinking about that apple tree all day," he admitted softly. "I wondered why it held on so tight when others let go freely." Maiko shrugged, standing up again and looking around at the falling leaves. "Maybe because it's afraid," she said. "Or maybe because sometimes we need a little extra warmth before winter comes." The old man nodded slowly, taking in her words without comment. He peeled back the apple skin with precision, tasting each piece he ate as if it were the first and last one of his life. As dusk began to settle over the orchard, they stood together quietly for a while longer, watching the leaves fall around them. Maiko finally picked up her basket and started walking again, leaving him alone under the tree. Before she was too far away, she turned back briefly. "Remember," she called out softly without looking at him directly. "Sometimes all you need to do is give it a little help to let go." The old man stood there for some time after her voice faded into the distance, holding his empty hands where the apple had been just moments ago. The last light of day shone through his fingers as if he held nothing at all but the promise of what could be left behind.
The last leaf fluttered down to join its fallen comrades, spinning briefly in a reluctant farewell. As dusk falls and leaves whisper their stories, may these words linger like memories of an empty tea house. The empty tea house rests. Until tomorrow.